All right. Good morning. I am going to present you the work I have been doing over the past 6 months on building a population model for ABATUS cordatus, a sea urchin endemic to the Kerguelen Islands. And this has been done with the purpose of trying to appraise the application of such models to study the response of the species to variations in environmental conditions. This work has been realized with the support of the Foundation for the Research for Biodiversity. Where are the Kerguelen Islands? So it is situated between the Indian Ocean and the Antarctic Ocean. It's right here. As a polar region, it is particularly impacted by climate change. On the Kerguelen Plateau, I focused on a population of ABATUS cordatus that is situated on this side here. ABATUS cordatus is endemic to the Kerguelen Islands. It has a particularity of being a brooding species, which means that the mothers carry their youngs in dorsal pouches. Right here you can see young ones. They are also living burrowed in the surface sediment, and they feed on particular organic matter that they find around them in the sediment. It is a species that is sensitive to environmental conditions, and it is expected to be highly affected by future climates. To have an estimation of the response of the species to different environmental conditions, there has been some correlative model constructed by Guillermo and her collaborators. Those models mapped the distribution of suitable and unsuitable areas for the species, both for the present and for estimated future conditions. However, those models are not don't give very fine results in the case of changing environmental conditions, which is why we decided to use a mechanistic approach. And from a model at the scale of the individual, I upscaled and constructed a population model. The model at the scale of the individual is a dynamic energy budget model, or DEB model. It relies on a theory that relies on biological principles and follows the energy flow inside the organism. It considers an organism as a dynamic system composed of different compartments, the main one being the reserve here, which stores all the energy that is assimilated into the organism, and then it allocates the energy to different compartments. Here you have the structure, the maturation, and then the maintenance of maturity and structure. In this model, we have forcing variables, which means environmental elements that affect the metabolic processes. Those are the availability of food, the resources, and the temperature. With this dynamic energy budget model, I can follow the life cycle of the organism from embryo to juveniles, then adult, until their death. And from this model at the scale of the individual, I constructed a population model using individual-based model, or IBM, in which every single organism is an autonomous entity represented in the model and has its own development that is taken from the DEB model, to which I added an individual variation factor. And in my population model, all the individual forms the dynamic of the population in a specific environment. This is a quick overview of the programming work. So in my model, I input variables that are individual parameters, resources, and then temperature. And then inside the model, I do a program for each of the elements, relying on ecological knowledge that I research in the literature and in studies. And I implement all those with a code that I use in the software in NetLogo. What I'm using for the environmental conditions, I am getting resources data from what has been collected by Delille and Bouvy, who collected a percentage of organic carbon found in the sediment over a year for my site. And then for temperature, there is an ongoing program monitoring on the Kerguelen Islands, and they have daily records of temperature for a span of 6 years. With this programming work, I am trying to observe the evolution of the individual metabolism for the present, and also the evolution of the population structure, both for the present conditions and for estimated future conditions. For future conditions, I have different scenarios. One pessimistic scenario sees a warming of sea surface temperature of around 1.7 degrees and a diminution of resources by 20%, while the optimistic scenario has a warming of around 1.1 degrees Celsius and a diminution of resources by 10%. What I also have is two different kinds of sensitivity for my population. One is more sensitive, one is less sensitive to high temperatures. My first results for now are for my individual model. Here you have the monthly change in the density of energy in the reserve over 1 year, and the monthly change in the energy in the maturation compartment over the same year for female adults. What happens is in the reserve, the energy that is there is allocated to compartments depending on the density in the reserve, not on the availability of resources. The availability of resources plays a role in what comes into the reserve. So what I have here is that during the austral summer, and in October and November, I have an increase in my reserve density that goes along with an increase in my resources availability. And then, as my resources availability decreases and my organism is asking for more energy, I have a decrease in my reserve density. It is either constant or even decreases for the next month until it keeps up. It keeps back up until the next summer period. For my reproduction compartment, I am around 0 around March, April, and May, because during that period is the reproduction period where all the energy stored in the compartment is delivered into gametes. Afterwards, it picks back up until the onset of the next reproduction period in March. Here are the results for my population structure for present conditions. You have on the y-axis the density of individuals per square meter over a time span of 6 years. And in purple is the juveniles population. In orange, you have the adult population. There is distinct patterns for both populations. In purple, for the juveniles, you see that there is an increase each year that comes with the reproduction period, and a decrease each year that is the consequence of 41% background mortality. For my adult population, it is more constant. However, I still have an increase each year as juveniles become adults, and the decrease is due to 21% of background mortality plus a mortality that I forced upon all my individuals that are over 7 years old. For future projections, here I present you one of the scenarios, the results for one of the scenarios, the most pessimistic one, so minus 20% of resources and plus 1.7 degree of sea surface temperature, and this is for my sensitive population. Here you have the graph that we just saw before for current conditions. What we see is that there is a clear difference with almost 60% less individuals in my population. And there is a different pattern in my juvenile population that's clearly seen. It also exists in the adult population, but it's more visible in the juveniles, where I have actually an additional decrease here every year that is an additional mortality. When I look at this graph of cumulative mortality, so this is the cumulative number of dead individuals over my 6 years time span, and here you have the same but for the current conditions. In gray is the total, is the overall causes of death, so all causes of death confounded, while we see that in red is the death caused by temperature, and for future conditions it is almost as high as the background temperature, so it has a very strong contribution to overall mortality, as the background mortality, sorry. While in the current conditions, only the background mortality has a strong effect, and there is no effect of the temperature mortality. When we look at the mortality caused by starvation in yellow, you actually have no effect either in the current or in the future conditions. This has been the first time such a population model combining both DEB and IBM models has been designed for the Antarctic area. And we are still working on it, but what has been achieved so far is that we managed to model the life cycle of the individual and the energetic evolution of some of the compartments. We also managed to follow the population structure for my site over the 6 years I have, and to have an idea of future conditions, future response of the population under simulated environmental conditions. This model can be refined, especially in some aspects. For the senescence part, I have an aging submodel that actually does not give the desired results. So that's why I applied a background mortality, supplementary background mortality, that I calculated from data in the literature. However, having more data on the senescence of the species would allow to have a finer submodel for death due to age. And for what is temperature, temperature is implemented into the model in each of the parameters. However, for the mortal effect of the temperature, I have designed a gradient of mortality from data that has been collected through an experiment, because it would be more interesting actually to have knowledge on the upper limit of the temperature tolerance curve of my species. However, I don't have it, which is why I had to design this gradient of mortality. And for what is fecundity, I put fecundity of around 27 youngs per females, eggs per females, which is an average value that is found in the literature. However, data shows that there is a high variability between individuals, and implementing this would actually allow to have a supplementary stochasticity in my model, which would refine it a bit more. What is the future of this work, the near future? We would like to compare population dynamics for different sites where we know there are population of this species and we know the environmental conditions are different. So we would like to apply the model to those different populations to observe if there is a spatial differences. Then we would also like to do geographic projections, this time of the individual parameters, the individual traits of the animals, and try to compare this with future conditions as well to see how it would affect those individual traits spatially. And lastly, this this kind of model could actually be applied to conservation techniques, either in the Kerguelen first, where there is some protected areas, but also in other regions in the subantarctic ocean.